One of the most dangerous things that can happen inside a growing business is this. The business starts confusing managerial preference with operational wisdom. And at first, it barely looks like a problem because experienced managers usually do develop instinct. They learn where the delays occur, where the employees are struggling, where customers become frustrated, where pressure builds operationally. So naturally, managers start reshaping the operation around those experiences. One will speed things up, one simplifies explanations, one skips steps that they personally think are unnecessary. One becomes stricter after a bad experience. Individually, those decisions often feel reasonable. But over time, something more dangerous starts happening. The operation slowly becomes manager shaped instead of system shaped. That changes the culture more than businesses realize. Because now employees are no longer learning how does this business operate? They are learning how does this manager operate? And that distinction matters because once the workplace starts becoming personality dependent, consistency becomes temporary. And eventually, the business develops invisible operational geography. Employees know which shifts are easier, which managers enforce detail, where the shortcuts are tolerated, who creates stress, who ignores policy, where accountability actually matters. None of that is usually documented, but operationally, everybody feels it. That is when different departments, shifts, and managers slowly stop operating like parts of the same system and start operating more like neighboring territories sharing the same logo. And honestly, this is where leadership often misses the deeper issue because businesses usually evaluate inconsistency at the employee level. But operational inconsistency is often being generated structurally, that is, through unmanaged managerial interpretation. That is a much more mature operational conversation because now we're no longer discussing training alone. And once businesses lose that consistency, interpretation quietly starts filling the gaps. That is where operational drift usually begins. Most operational drift does not begin through intentional decisions, though. It begins through repeated interpretation that slowly stops getting corrected because the system itself is no longer reinforcing consistency, but personalities are. And my friends, personalities are naturally inconsistent. One manager may genuinely believe that they're helping by simplifying the process. Another manager may believe that they're helping by being flexible. Another manager may think, well, we all know what we mean. We don't need to be that formal about it. Meanwhile, employees are trying to figure out which version of the operation is the real one. That creates constant uncertainty, especially for new employees, especially in fast moving workplaces, especially in environments where people are already trying not to make mistakes. And this is where businesses often misread what they're seeing. Because once the workplace becomes personality dependent, employees stop learning the operation socially through consistency and they start learning it politically. So the operation becomes politically educational instead of operationally educational. And employees start learning things like who gets frustrated easily, whose standards matter the most, who allows shortcuts, who enforces detail, which corrections can I safely ignore. That changes workplace behavior completely. And from leadership's perspective, it can start looking like employees suddenly need excessive reassurance and clarification and handholding. But honestly, a lot of the time, employees are not struggling because they lack capability. They're struggling because the operation keeps changing shape depending on who is managing the shift. That, my friends, is a system problem, not a motivation problem. And this is the part businesses usually underestimate. Operational inconsistency creates emotional instability inside the workplace. Employees stop trusting their own decisions because every correction starts feeling personal. One manager rewards initiative, another rewards strict process compliance, and still another quietly prioritizes speed over procedure whenever things get busy. And eventually, employees just stop focusing on performing consistently and they start focusing on reading the room correctly. That changes workplace behavior in ways businesses often underestimate. Decision making slows down, employees wait for reassurance, managers start correcting the same issues repeatedly, and operational confidence becomes increasingly personality dependent. Eventually, strong employees start compensating for the inconsistency themselves. You know the employees I mean, like the ones that everybody depends on, the people who quietly explain things to everybody else, the people who smooth over the confusion, the people who know how each manager prefers things to be done. Those employees slowly become the operational translators, and businesses often mistake that for strength. But operationally, that is usually a warning sign because now consistency is living inside people instead of inside the system. And once that starts happening, the operation becomes fragile. If one strong employee leaves, clarity leaves with them. If one strong manager is absent, consistency disappears. That, my friends, is not stability. That is operational dependency. Mature operations think differently about this. Mature operations understand that consistency is not created by hiring good people alone. Consistency is created by reinforcement, and reinforcement has to survive different personalities, different shifts, different managers, different locations, operational stress, busy days, staffing shortages, interruptions. Because if consistency only exists when the right manager is working, then the business never actually develops institutional behavior. It develops managerial islands. And eventually, every manager starts inheriting a different version of the operation. So one team becomes detail oriented, another becomes speed oriented, another becomes workaround oriented. Not because leadership intentionally designed it that way, but because interpretation was allowed to compound unchecked. And over time, that creates a strange kind of organizational instability. The business still looks unified from the outside, but internally, different parts of the operation are slowly developing different definitions for urgency, accountability, quality, communication, acceptable behavior. And that creates friction that businesses often struggle to explain clearly. So now meetings become repetitive, cross training becomes harder, managers start disagreeing with each other publicly, employees receive mixed reinforcement, and eventually the operation becomes difficult to scale cleanly because businesses do not scale consistency automatically. They scale whatever behavior the system repeatedly reinforces. That is what operational inconsistency quietly turns into over time. And honestly, this is where operational leadership starts becoming very different from day to day management because surface level management usually reacts to inconsistency after it becomes visible. But operational leadership pays attention to the conditions creating inconsistency in the first place. Mature leaders eventually realize something important. Workplace behavior is always being trained. The only question is whether the business is training that behavior intentionally or accidentally. Because every repeated workaround teaches something, every inconsistent correction teaches something, every unmanaged managerial interpretation teaches something. And over time, those repeated signals slowly become workplace culture. That is why mature operations become extremely intentional about reinforcement, not because they want robotic environments, but because they understand that unstable reinforcement creates unstable behavior. And eventually, the business starts producing different operational habits depending on the manager, the shift, the location, the pressure level, who trained the employee originally. That is not scalability, that is behavioral fragmentation. So mature leaders stop asking, why aren't employees more consistent? And they start asking, what behaviors is this operation repeatedly rewarding? Because whatever the system repeatedly rewards eventually becomes normalized, even if leadership never intended it. And honestly, that is usually the deeper operational challenge businesses are actually fighting. not employee attitude, not motivation, not work ethic. Behavioral inconsistency is often being reinforced structurally, and that is why mature operations become far more deliberate about reinforcement, alignment, managerial calibration, operational language, shared expectations, because operational culture is not built through mission statements. It is built through repeated behavioral reinforcement. And ultimately, that reinforcement determines whether the business develops operational consistency or operational drift. So, if you're noticing repeated corrections, constant clarification, manager frustration, inconsistent execution, dependency on specific people, employees second guessing themselves, do not immediately assume that the employee is the problem. Start looking for operational drift. Ask, are managers reinforcing the same expectations? Are shortcuts quietly replacing the standards? Does the process change depending on who is leading? Are employees learning the system or are they learning personalities? Because businesses often believe they have standards. What they actually have is interpretation. And interpretation, my friends, compounds over time, especially in growing businesses. Because what feels small eventually turns into confusion, inconsistency, dependency, operational friction, leadership exhaustion. That is why mature operations tighten reinforcement before breakdown becomes visible. Not because they're obsessed with being in control, but because they understand clarity reduces operational strain. This is really about whether the business itself creates operational stability, because employees should not have to decode the workplace every day just to feel successful. The operation itself should create clarity. That is what mature systems do. They reduce interpretation, they reduce hesitation, they reduce dependency. And over time, they create workplaces where expectations stay recognizable, even when managers change, pressure increases, shifts become busy, new employees enter the operation. That is what operational maturity actually looks like. Because operational consistency is not something businesses accidentally maintain, it is something mature systems intentionally reinforce. And that is why, my friends, better systems build better workplaces.